Hello, everyone. My name is Susan Driver. I'm a professor in media and communication studies at York University in Toronto, and I'm going to give a talk today called Heavy Emotions, Ecological Awareness, and Capacious Storytelling, Youth Activists Expressing All the Feelings. And this talk is a small part of a book project that I'm working on that addresses youth climate activist storytelling. And the title of this conference really made me think a lot about how the heavy emotions of young people in the face of the climate crisis are rarely considered as part of their world building projects. So that, while concepts such as climate anxiety have often been the dominant term to reference and to address the emotional predicament of youth in a time of climate crisis, it often becomes abstracted from the ecological and social justice reckonings within youth activism. And so I'm interested in reading youth stories for how they process emotions and mobilize them in nuanced ways. Climate justice work involves opposing carbon economies and fossil fuel industries while addressing the frontline impacts of fires and floods and droughts and pollution, alongside a continual grappling with the emotional stakes of death and loss and insecurity and extinctions and displacement and suffering. It's really heavy stuff. Yet listening to young activists expressing their anger and sadness in the wake of ecological degradation and devastation, it's also really striking how often their voices express love and attachments and a sense of wonder in relation to the natural world and in relation to the contexts of the communities that they live in, the places where they live. They are often these places, and their love for them are often the drivers of change and also the antidotes to the kind of pessimistic carbon cultures and anthropocentrism that often separates human culture from the natural world. Young people's emergent and overlapping ecological and political awareness is remarkable for how it holds multiple visions, feelings, and ideas together. The challenge becomes fine-tuning our attention to the subtleties of their emotional story work. And so, in this first screen, I've got a picture, of course, of what we've seen in the news over the past few years of protesters with these dramatic statements on placards. You'll die of old age, we'll die of climate change. And those messages are really important, and they're very, kind of directly addressing the dark emotions, the dark climate emotions that many young people feel. But I also wanted to pair it with an image of Leah Thomas, who's an environmental activist who wrote the book, The Intersectional Environmentalist. Um, uh, in terms of an image of quiet reflection, of actually enjoying the environment, of feeling connected to the natural world. And those are images that we rarely see of young people. I've just finished writing a paper on the division within digital culture that often, kind of creates moral panics around young people and technology at the expense of really understanding that they are often engaging with technology in relation to the natural world, that these things come together in their lives. So the part of what I'm trying to do in this paper is think those things simultaneously through the work of young people's stories. And there's really no doubt that there's so much out there in terms of learning from young people's stories. I just put on the screen here a few of the books written by young people, young activists. And many of these books are really remarkable reflections on their emerging political and ecological awareness. These books are also kind of fascinating in that they crisscross genres and, combine creative and analytical forms of writing. They're really hybrid forms of political and personal storytelling. And it part of one of the concepts that I work with is a notion of intimate counter-public climate storytelling. And so much of the political work that young people are doing is extremely intimate, while it's also targeting systemic forms of injustice, and it's doing these things in conjunction. So I think that's something that I really want to pay attention to. But in contrast to this diverse work, what we see in the mainstream media is often a kind of stark image of what a climate activist is. And often it's projected through the notion of climate anxiety, which, as I argue in my bigger project, is often, hyper individualized, psychologized, and pathologized in ways that often leaves out, the breadth of youth experience. Mainstream media have created a lot of narrow images and tropes of doomism and apocalypse that center on youth fearing for their future. And these, in this case, it's Greta Thunberg sitting in a solitary pose that, really got repeated over and over again. Rarely do we see Greta in the groups of solidarity and friendship that she certainly frames herself in on her own social media, and in terms of the kind of work that she's doing. So what we see here is a fixation on kind of a generalized and individualized issue of climate anxiety that tends to frame youth in closed and siloed ways. In representational terms, it ends up focusing on an image often of sad girls, what I call, it's like a repetition of the sad girl, the sad, angry girl. And it's often a sad, angry girl in isolation. Not only are negative emotions and narratives emphasized within this trope, but they are decontextualized from collective engagements and ecological awareness that gives rise to more complex and ambivalent activist storytelling. And a lot of the activist storytelling interweaves feelings and experiences of hope and joy, alongside, gripping analysis of ecological catastrophe and devastation. And I think that combining, that ambivalent combining is what gets lost here. There's a youth, a writer and activist, Tori Choi, who has written extensively about how Western discourses privilege heroic, individualizing approaches to climate anxiety at the expense of transformative possibilities of community building, and also more regenerative kinds of engagements with the natural world. So up against those static accounts, media accounts of crisis, we come to a lot of the youth activist storytelling that, is so vibrant, what I call they're vibrant, multidimensional stories. So here I'll give an example of Dominique Palmer's visual storytelling on TikTok. Um, and this screen, I've just highlighted some stills from a video where she's immersed in nature and overlays these images of herself with a song from the Hunger Games, "You Can't Catch Me Now." And Palmer often uses music and poetry to flesh out her responses and gestures towards pleasure and imagination. Um, she often actually explicitly talks about the limits of the perfectionist norms around youth activism, what adults expect of youth activists, and really interrupts that with these kind of, beautiful images of herself thinking about a range of, aspects of her world and being curious about different forms of politics, different kinds of sustainable fashion, different kinds of, a, a kind of adoration for different kinds of animals. She interrupts and plays with the kind of monolithic stereotypes by breaking them open. And such dynamic ecological engagements that really focus in also on the present of her enjoyment are often missing from media accounts of climate anxiety. Nature, but it's also, I think, important to see that nature in Palmer's work and many of the other activists I look at emphasize interdependency, that in terms of nature, that she thinks through in political ways. So she's really considering she starts with the story of her own childhood, um, in her telling of why she became an activist, as many of the activists do. And in her case, it's the vulnerability of growing up on a highly polluted street in London and starting to think about the inequities of access to green spaces and exclusionary histories of environmentalism. And her stories come to affirm nature while also challenging apolitical notions of innocence or romantic associations of children with nature. So nature is a space of interpretation and civic responsibility, an embodied and creative realm of experience that drives her activism and also offers a space for healing and connection. And I think it's really beautiful work. It highly suggest you checking it out. Similarly, Maya Rose Craig's work also combines various strands of ecological and political engagement. At the center of her work is her passionate love of bird watching. And it's important to see, like, against this sort of the sort of broad strokes through which a lot of activists are presented, is that these stories really detail the intricate kind of entry points that shape the childhood activist fascination with the natural world and desire to protect it. Studying and caring for bird species and habitats for Craig becomes a site for analyzing not only birds, but also analyzing systemic injustice that restrict BIPOC young people from participating in conservation projects. And the history of conservation has been, whitewashed, and it's created a lot of exclusionary boundaries that Craig works to overcome. And one of the really interesting projects that Craig works on is a camp called Black to Nature for city kids who lack access to nature, which is an ongoing project. And her projects and her stories all really kind of point out the entanglements of political as well as emotional and ecological problems without trying to resolve them into sort of single solutions, but also, like, this camp is a very kind of pragmatic, concrete, place-based um, uh, alternative, right? She's working cross-generationally on this. She's working, with a number of organizations to be able to mobilize this kind of work. So I just also should point out that she has a book out called Bird Girl, which you may have seen in the stores. It's a fantastic book. But what's really interesting, is that a lot of these activists, they have sort of small scale micro storytelling that's across their social media platforms, that then gets really expanded and enriched as they move on to publishing their stories long form. So this is one case where we get a really big picture. We get a lot of interconnecting stories and entangled narratives that bring together these different facets of her work and life. So I'm realizing I'm running a little bit out of time here. I had a few more examples, but I think I'm just going to also I'll skip over to the importance of care, because I think that's something that often does get left out of the dominant story around climate anxiety, and care emerges as an important range of ways, central to Tory Choi's work, among many other activists. Care becomes a key site for talking about vulnerability and interdependency in relation to both ecological and social justice. And care is narrated in political ways through intersectional frameworks that address power inequities and the problem of neoliberal careless systems and societies. So there's a deep critique. This is not just about a kind of interpersonal practice of care. It's also about like a kind of a way into, understanding the ways in which ecological catastrophe are tied to many different systems of carelessness. Um, and a lot of the thinking about care by these young people goes beyond human-centered models, which I think is really interesting to think of how, they are exceeding the kind of nature culture binaries that are so endemic within uh, thinking, humanistic thinking about care, but also humanistic thinking about activism. And so the dynamic thinking about care work by young people is often also directed to teaching young people, peer-to-peer teaching about how to care for each other, how to take responsibility for the natural world, but to embed care in the organizing principles. And I think that's a really unique feature of this generation's organizational practice. Sort of end on this slide because I think Jamie Margolin's work is amazing. Jamie Margolin was one of the founders of Zero Hour, and she also has a book out that reflects on her experiences as an organizer and really works to teach other youth how to do activist work. But I think what's interesting here in a lot of Margolin's work of reflective kind of storytelling, speaking to young activists about what she's learned and sort of the problems of activism and the kind of stresses of activism, is that the emphasis on care is also addresses the heavy burden of climate activist work. And she among many others that I've mentioned so far, and many other activists across the globally, really have propelled out of this self-awareness around burnout and around the kind of emotional impact of doing climate activist work is generating forms of self-care and talking about self-care and generating modes of caring strategies, self-care strategies that are part of their public climate conversations. I just took an image from off social media here where we see Jamie Margolin sort of sharing her, her moment of rest and quiet and attunement to one of her favorite places, the Bay Area. And I think, once again, this affirmation of place and this affirmation of the present and of caring and loving the present and of slowing down and developing informal strategies for rest and recuperation, all of these elements of the storytelling are really important. The kind of quiet, slow, reflexive dimensions of the work that they're doing and the kind of knowledge that they're gaining about themselves and the world is often left out when the framework is centered on these dominant cultural valorizations of loud, dramatic, instrumental forms of activism. So I think it's really interesting to start to pay attention to them. I'm just gonna just put a few more not questions really, but just points to consider, things that I've already sort of started thinking about, but just kind of summarizing them here. Questioning reductionist and individualizing stories about young people's climate anxiety, acknowledging a multiplicity of emotional responses in stories, using intersectional frameworks, centering social justice within youth climate storytelling, turning attention toward the ways young activists combine ecological and political awareness, valuing storylines that foster relational and interdependent approaches, considering how caring relations are mobilized by youth, and attuning to youth attachments, desires, hopes, feelings of joy, reflecting on how and why we read, interpret, use, and overlook these stories. So something to think about, and I look forward to chatting and having a longer conversation about this.